Hey, this is the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Friday, December 16, 2016. So, I've been getting some listener feedback, which is great, but I've taken note of the one reoccurring theme, which is please keep the episodes to 5 minutes. And it's a fair call. It's supposed to be the 5-minute podcast review. So it's kind of embarrassing that the last episode ran to 11 minutes. One thing I've done is ditch the intro music. That buys back a few seconds, and I didn't really like it anyway. So, first podcast this week, and remember, no need to take notes. Links are all on your screen. First podcast is Blacklist Table Reads. Now, you may know a table read is an important part of the process of getting a film or stage play produced. It's where actors literally sit around a table and read the script or the screenplay for the first time, and it helps the producers, the director, and the actors problem solve and refine the script. The Blacklist Table Reads podcast takes the best screenplays that, to use their words, Hollywood hasn't yet made, and records the table reads, complete with screen and camera directions. Generally, there's one table read podcast a month, along with a few other shorter podcasts in the feed, which are usually interviews with the screenwriter or others involved in that month's table read. If this sounds like it's interesting to you, then search out Blacklist Table Reads. Podcast number 2 is Layovers. If you're a frequent air traveller or just an aviation geek, you'll find plenty of interesting episodes here. There's an episode roughly every 2 weeks where the hosts, both frequent flyers, talk about everything air travel. And it's more from an experienced passenger perspective than from a technical pilot or cabin crew perspective. So it's things like how to get 1 million frequent flyer miles, aeroplane food, the best and worst airports in the world, or comparing passenger features on differing aircraft types and airlines. So, before your next long-haul flight, subscribe and download a few episodes of Layovers. On to podcast number 3, which is Startup. Now, I know many of you are well aware of Startup, so this is really just a pointer to the current season if you haven't tuned into it yet. It focuses on Dov Charney, the founder of American Apparel, who ended up being ditched from the company in controversial circumstances, and he's now starting up a new clothing business. Dov Charney obviously allowed Startup to document this process in a fairly access all areas way, but it may be a decision he's now regretting based on the cliffhanger ending of the most recent episode.
I have to stop the tape here, because this part of the conversation is off the record. But it was here that things took an extremely disturbing turn. Dov became enraged in a way I have never experienced with another person. We've asked Dov to allow us to play the off-the-record portion of this conversation for you. He has not agreed to let us air this tape. I can't give specific details, but I can tell you there's a lot more to this story than I ever thought when I first started reporting. We'll get into that on the next episode of Startup.
Podcast number 4 is Millennial, and it's worth explaining first who millennials actually are. The definition is a bit loose, but it's basically people born around the time of the millennium, around the year 2000 or maybe a few years before. So people who have really only known life in the 2000s, and the oldest of them are now young adults, and they're figuring out what they're going to do in life. And the situation they face is quite different from any other generation before. One millennial, Megan Tan, has been documenting her journey, which is what the Millennial podcast is. If you are a millennial, or if you have millennials in your life, have a listen to this podcast and start from episode 1. It has some real twists and turns, and I don't want to say much more about it because I don't want to spoil it. And actually, Megan's story is still evolving. So just subscribe to Millennial and listen from episode 1. Last podcast for this episode, and one that I've just discovered, is Completely Optional Knowledge. This podcast describes itself as the podcast that answers the questions you never knew you had. Questions like, why do we laugh at pain? Why do siblings have rivalries? Are there lazy ants? Can music make you hungry? And this question, which was the subject of the April 5th episode.
So, Troy, I understand that you have a question for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to know what animal has the worst smelling farts.
And all I'll say to that is you will never guess the answer. But if you want to find out, have a listen to the appropriately named podcast, Completely Optional Knowledge. And with that, the big news is that I have finally pulled an episode in under 5 minutes, the first so far. I'll try and do it again next week when I'll be back with 5 more podcasts. Thanks for listening.